Hi, let's start on our second part of negligence, and this relates to causation. Causation has two parts, actual and proximate, and again, you have to prove that both were present. If one is missing, then you don't have causation. If you don't have causation, you don't have negligence. So, what does actual cause mean? Actual cause, sometimes described as the but-for test, meaning if it hadn't been for what the defendant did, would this accident have occurred the way it did? But for the fact that the defendant ran the red light, would the plaintiff's car have been sideswiped that night? If your answer is no, it wouldn't have happened other than for what the defendant did, then the defendant is the actual cause of the plaintiff's injury. But that's not enough. In negligence, we don't punish people simply for actually causing harm to others. It has to also be true that they should have known better under the circumstances, meaning that they should have realized that their conduct was creating a risk of harm to others, like the plaintiff. So the second part of causation, if you can prove the first part, actual cause, the second part is proximate cause. Was it reasonably foreseeable that the defendant's conduct could cause the plaintiff's injury or loss? It means, should you reasonably have anticipated that you could cause this loss? Not that it was automatically certain to be true. It doesn't mean probably that it would cause a loss, but should you have anticipated it could cause this loss? Okay. Should you anticipate that if you drive carelessly and you run a red light, that you could sideswipe another motorist? Of course. That's completely foreseeable. Does it always occur that way? No, thank heavens it doesn't. But should you foresee that's a reasonably foreseeable possibility? The answer is yes, of course. Okay, here's a sample question. Suppose Gianni was a passenger on a ferry and it's operated by Catalina Incorporated. Catalina was required by state law to have life vests for each passenger, but despite that, Catalina had only 50 vests, although the ferry routinely carried 100 passengers. The Catalina ferry, which was being operated carefully and lawfully, was struck and damaged by another boat being carelessly piloted by a drunk sailor. In other words, it was all the other boat's fault. Gianni was injured when the boat struck the ferry, causing Gianni to trip, fall, and break his leg. Was Catalina's failure to have adequate life vests negligent? Okay, so whenever you have a torts problem, start at the beginning of the tort. First off, did Catalina owe a duty to Gianni? What's the test for duty? Should Catalina have anticipated that Gianni was relying on Catalina for his safety? Well, sure. You would assume that the boat is going to be carefully outfitted and operated. So, yes, Catalina should have anticipated that Gianni was relying on them for his safety. Okay, so the first part of negligence is met. Number two, did Catalina breach a duty to Gianni? Well, with regard to the life vests, yes, they did breach a duty. They had a duty to have enough life vests for everyone on board, and they didn't. Number three, did Catalina's breach of their duty to have adequate life vests actually cause Gianni's injury? Well, no. Whether they had enough life vests on the boat or not is irrelevant. He would still have broken his leg. It wasn't related to the life vests. So make sure that whatever the failure is you identified, that's what actually caused the plaintiff's injury. I think sometimes students just latch on to a failure, like, you did this wrong, I caught you. That's not enough. You have to show that this failure actually caused the injury that the plaintiff's suing for. And in this case, it did not. Here's another sample question. Tran versus Wendy. Suppose Wendy's driving carelessly on the freeway. She's drunk, she's speeding, she loses control of her car. She careens off the freeway. Her car strikes a utility pole. This causes the power to be lost at a nearby hospital. so that Tran, who is a patient at the hospital, the operation is disrupted. Tran suffers physical injuries as a result of the power stoppage. In Tran versus Wendy, what result? Okay, first off, look at what the question is. What you're going to be tempted to do is to look at the hospital and say, well, wasn't the hospital negligent in not having a backup power source? He was having his procedure at the hospital. Well, sure, but that's not the question. The question is Tran versus Wendy, and your professor's asking you that question for some reason, and that's what the professor wants to hear about. So answer it. Okay, Tran versus Wendy. Was Wendy negligent? Another thing to be careful of with all law exams, but especially negligence, don't start with your conclusion. Of course, we want to say, yeah, Wendy's a drunk, speeding idiot. Yeah, she's liable. Stop. Don't do this. Start at the beginning of negligence, work through the elements, and determine whether or not Wendy is negligent. First off, does Wendy owe a duty to Tran? The test for duty is, should Wendy have anticipated that Tran was relying upon Wendy for his safety while he's having a procedure at the hospital? Well, that's kind of a stretch. You wouldn't think you were relying on motorists on the freeway when you're in the hospital having a procedure being done. It's going to be pretty hard for Tran to prove that Wendy owed him a duty while she's driving. Now, if this happens on an exam, do you say, therefore no duty is owed and therefore there is no negligence? No, because you want to demonstrate to your professor that you know the entire tort. So you may want to say at this point, this will be extremely difficult for Tran to prove. However, if Tran's able to prove it, the next question would be, did Wendy breach a duty? Well, in terms of driving, did Wendy behave like a reasonable person? Did she exercise reasonable care? Of course not. She's drunk. She's speeding. That's not reasonable. So she certainly breached a duty of reasonable care, assuming Tran can prove a duty. Did her breach actually cause Tran's injuries? But for the fact that Wendy is a drunk and careless idiot driving on the freeway, she would not have lost control of her car. Her car would not have flown off the freeway. It would not have hit a utility pole. It would not have caused the power to be lost at the hospital. And Tran's operation would not have been compromised. Did Wendy actually cause harm to Tran? Yes. Part 2 of causation. Was it reasonably foreseeable? Is it reasonably foreseeable that if you are a drunk idiot driver that you will mess up someone's operation in a hospital? Well, that's pretty far-fetched, isn't it? I mean, imagine that you're a drunk driver. Give me some ideas about the worst things that could happen. Could you get in an accident on the freeway? Can you foresee that occurring? Sure. Can you foresee that accident harming other motorists, other passengers, possibly even people nearby the freeway, pedestrians possibly? Yes, yes, yes. Can you imagine maybe even people nearby if you lost control of your car and the car went off the freeway? Yes, you can imagine harming them. But can you imagine a hospital somehow losing control of an operation because you had an accident on the freeway? That's so far out of the realm of reasonable foreseeability. The court would say, although Wendy was the actual cause of Tran's injuries, she was not the proximate cause of his injuries. It's simply too far-fetched. We only hold you liable for the foreseeable consequences of your careless behavior. And therefore, a court would probably conclude that Wendy was not negligent for two reasons. First, duty, and second, lack of proximate cause. The fourth and last element of negligence is damages, and this is the simplest one. For damages, you must prove that there were compensatory damages suffered by the plaintiff. Compensatory damages, repeating what we talked about in an earlier podcast, include actual out-of-pocket loss, how much poorer are you because of this event, and general damages. It does not include punitive damages. You will not get punitive damages typically for non-intentional torts. The goal with non-intentional torts, like negligence, is to make the wrongdoer pay for the cost of the wrongdoer's conduct. But we're not punishing the wrongdoer because the wrongdoer wasn't intentionally, maliciously harming someone else. One more time on actual damages, the question is, how much did the plaintiff lose because of the defendant's conduct? How much poorer is the plaintiff? Let's take an example to show actual damages. Okay, I'll give you one from my life. I had parked my husband's car and in a marked legal parking space on the street and went inside to a restaurant, met some friends for dinner. While I was in the restaurant, a crazy driver made a left turn on a city street at 70 miles an hour and crashed into my car, taking the front end off, well, my husband's car, taking the front end off the car. Okay. This was in California. California is a comparative negligence state. Comparatively, how negligent was I as the plaintiff? 0. The car was legally parked. The car was not moving. So there's 0 comparative negligence. It's 100% the defendant's fault. What kind of damages did my husband and I suffer? Well, out-of-pocket loss, there was damage to the car that needed to be repaired. There were thankfully no medical expenses that you often find in car accidents because thankfully no one was in my car, my husband's car. There was no lost wages, another common form of actual damages because, again, no one was injured. And therefore, the only actual damages would be the cost of the car repair, the cost of renting a car while the car was being repaired. That's kind of it. How about general damages? Was there pain and suffering? Well, no, because thank heavens no one was in the car, so no one suffered any pain or any suffering. It's very common in car accidents that someone does, unfortunately, suffer pain, but that didn't happen in this case, so you're not going to get it. I've often had students saying, but what about all the nuisance of it? What about the trouble you had to take? Unfortunately, that is not an element of compensatory damages. So for compensatory damages, you must show that there was some actual out-of-pocket loss, and if there has been general damages, that also qualifies as compensatory damages. Okay, that concludes this podcast.